The last great Time War was the war between the Daleks and the Time Lords. The war to end all wars, with the whole of creation at stake. It's a conflict which has no start and no end. It's timeless and limitless, being fought throughout countless different time periods lasting for an eternity, as both sides fought across space and time, costing the lives of millions. But what was the trigger point which kicked the Time War into motion? When did the whole thing start, and what happened in between? But most importantly, what events led to its end? Let's delve deep into all of these questions and more as we explore the story of the last great Time War. The Time War may not have kicked into gear until later on in the Doctor Who timeline, but it was prophesied by the Time Lords for a long time before it began. In the Doctor Who audio Fugitives, the 8th Doctor was warned of something terrible in the time tracks by his fellow Time Lord Straxus. The Matrix also prophesied that Gallifrey would be destroyed in a war in various other audio stories. The Daleks also foreseen the conflict, as in the Doctor Who short story Birth of a Legend, the Dalek Emperor received predictions of an oncoming war against an ancient enemy of the Daleks, a war which would rage throughout time and space and would in turn require the Dalek Empire's every strategy and resource in order to survive. Friction first began between the Time Lords and the Daleks at the very beginning of the Daleks' creation. They first came to the attention of the Time Lords when the Daleks created a time machine of their own, and pursued the First Doctor through time in a failed attempt to kill him. This opened the Time Lords' eyes to a threat with power and capabilities that matched their own. The Daleks brought more attention to the Time Lords when the Third Doctor had to step in and prevent an alternative timeline in which the Daleks conquered Earth by starting World War III in the late 20th century. This caused the Time Lords to finally act. They sent the Fourth Doctor to Skaro by either a Time Lord from the present or a Time Lord who'd seen the future. They sent him to avert the creation of the Daleks. This could have been for a few reasons. They could have sent him so that the Doctor could simply interfere with the Daleks' development, making them less aggressive, or to find a weakness which the Time Lords could exploit ahead of the impending war. Or this could have been to destroy the Daleks full stop so that the war never happened at all. Despite their intentions, the Fourth Doctor of course refused, meaning that all the prophecies remained true and the Daleks continued to live on. The decision to send the Fourth Doctor to Skaro with the intention of stopping the Daleks' creation did backfire on the Time Lords, as this alerted the Daleks that both life and time travel did exist on other planets a lot earlier in their timeline than what it would have if the Doctor hadn't arrived on Skaro. This is believed to have fast-forwarded the Daleks' development early on and have the opposite effect to which the Time Lords intended it to. This misfire by the Time Lords is considered in many accounts to be the beginning of the Time War, referenced as the first shot fired. The impending war and the prophecies made both sides anxious to stop it before it properly began. The Daleks continued to develop their ability to time travel, and in early Dalek history they captured the 10th Doctor. They learned from the so-called Doctor of the Daleks of their future defeat in the Time War, and they tried to change their future by harnessing the Archean threshold. This was stopped by the 10th Doctor, who destroyed Dalek X and the Temporal Research Team, so that the information which they discovered about the future war was never shared to the other Daleks, keeping future events in place. It seemed that the Daleks and the Time Lords to and fro in the times that followed were to simply change the future course of events which they'd seen as part of the Time War. with the Daleks later attempting to create a duplicate of the Fifth Doctor who'd been sent to Gallifrey to assassinate the High Council of Time Lords. This failed and proved even more so that despite both sides' best efforts, the Time War could not be avoided. The tiny tremors up until this point eventually did lead to the complete eruption between both sides, following a huge act of violence towards the Daleks, which really was the trigger which set the Time War in motion. Davros tried to use the Hand of Omega against the Time Lords in remembrance of the Daleks, allowing the Daleks to have just as much power over time travel as the Time Lords did. But the Seventh Doctor tricked Davros into using the Hand of Omega to destroy their home planet of Skaro. This was the first major overstep between the two sides in all of the coming togethers that they'd had up until this point. The Time Lords were the ones who fired the first hard-hitting blow, and the Daleks could only retaliate in one way, and that was to declare all-out war on the Time Lords. The newly elected President Romana tried desperately to keep the peace with the Daleks before things got out of hand. She negotiated a peace treaty opened under the Act of the Master Restitution. This treaty was though broken when the Master survived execution on Skaro, being set free in the TV movie to cause havoc once again. This last-ditched attempt to ease the rising tensions between Gallifrey and the Dalek Empire had failed, leading to a full-blown conflict becoming inevitable. It started with the Daleks as they tried to invade Gallifrey by attempting to infiltrate both the Matrix and the Eye of Harmony, as well as creating a virus which would corrupt Time Lord DNA, wiping them out completely. These plans were thwarted by President Romana and her other incarnations, who managed to keep Gallifrey in one piece. This is believed to have been one of the potential moments when the Time Lords from the future constructed the plan and sent the Fourth Doctor all the way back to the Daleks' creation, which of course we mentioned earlier. Up until this point, despite being the initial trouble causers, it was the Daleks who were the aggressors, and the Time Lords were the ones who were trying to not react violently and keep the peace. This was until the Daleks attacked Time Lord allies, including the Mornons, the Sonari, the Nekastani, and the Feldonians. This gave the Time Lords no choice but to stand by their allies and retaliate by also declaring war back against the Daleks. Following the Daleks' attack on the Time Lords' allied planet of Phaedon, the War Council set up 6 different facilities around Gallifrey in order to support the war effort. These were known as the CIA, the Celestial Intervention Agency, with a 7th facility based in the Death Zone. The Time Lords also built multiple factories beneath Gallifrey where the children of Gallifrey worked on numerous different resources. In the first days of the Time War, the Zygons' home planet of Zygor was caught up in the conflict and destroyed. This led to the Zygons becoming proficient in their defence against battle TARDISes, tipping them on the side of the Daleks. This indicated that the destruction of their planet may have came at the hands of the Time Lords themselves. The Zygons weren't the only ones feeling the effects of the Time War though, with the Cybermen also feeling that too, and they attempted to invade the Time War via the use of virtual reality technology. This caught the attention of the Master, who became stranded in a parallel dimension which was invaded by these Cybermen. He decided to follow them with the intention of stealing their technology so he could fix his TARDIS, only to have it stolen and then having to escape before being cyber-converted. The Master worked alongside UNIT and destroyed the Cybermen by overloading them with the power from the infinite dimensions. This allowed the Master to return to the fray of the war and stop the Cybermen from properly entering it, which could have made the whole thing 1,000 times worse. The first major victory within the Time War fell to the Time Lords, and this was during the Battle of Keetal. Ketol was a planet which contained weapons which could turn the war on its head. The Daleks tried to mine the weapons from the planet, only for the Time Lords to defeat them. The Master played a huge part alongside his people in this victory, and it was known to be one of his greatest contributions towards the Time Lords' war effort. Another audacious plan which the Master concocted was to go back and interfere with the creation of the Daleks, but this time it was to replace Davros as the creator. This created more harm than good to the universe and the whole of history, threatening not only the existence of the Daleks, but the Time Lords as well. Luckily, the War Master and the Parallel Master were convinced to abandon this plan, meaning that once again, the war had to continue on. As the war began to spread throughout time and space and become more uncontrollable, many of the Doctor's friends were dragged into the fight too. Ace joined the Time Lord Irvin Braxatel as they went to the Obscura, a fracture in time which kills anyone who looked directly into it. They wanted to see if they could use this as a weapon against the Daleks. They tried to use it to destroy a Dalek fleet, but it didn't work. Ace's memory was then wiped by Braxatel as she was sent back to 20th century Earth, cast out from the Time War to live a normal life once again. Once President Romana was informed of Ace's quote-unquote death, she turned to the Master, teaming him up with the Doctor's companion Leela. They were sent to interrogate Finian Valentine, a freedom fighter who knew of the power source which could fuel the Time Lord energy banks. Once discovering the location of this source on the planet of Arkin, the Master betrayed Leela by expelling her into the time vortex, heading to Arkin so he could keep the source all to himself. He tried to steal the source multiple times from the planet Arkin, before it was eventually overrun by a Dalek invasion force, so he had to leave it behind, with the Master just managing to escape. Throughout the early days of the Time War, the Master continued to try and cheat the Time War by meddling with time and space over and over again. He took shortcuts to try and end the war, messing and twisting time more and more in the process. But it wasn't until he'd harnessed the power of the heavenly paradigm that the Master's meddling of the Time War came to an end. He tried to use the paradigm to create a brand new timeline, ending the Time War right there and then. This plan, though, backfired, and similar to his previous schemes, it caused more problems than solutions. The paradigm led to the Time Lords and the Daleks winning several battles which they'd originally lost, and vice versa, eventually allowing the Dalek Emperor to take control of the Time Lord's cruciform, a crucial asset to Gallifrey which they tried so hard to keep hidden from the Daleks up until this point. When the Master witnessed this, and indeed what he had done, his desperation and anxiety around the Time War reached tipping point. He believed that his latest desperate attempt to fix the war had failed, and that he'd handed the victory to the Daleks. Because of this, he decided to flee from the war to the end of the universe, turning himself human via the use of the Chameleon Arch. Still in the early days of the Time War, the Time Lords decided to resurrect Rassilon so he could lead the Time Lords into battle. They called this Project Revenant, a mission set up to bring Gallifrey's greatest minds back to life to help them win the war. However, the Daleks mistaken this and thought that it was a great way to convert Time Lords into Daleks. Romana tried to negotiate with the Dalek Emperor to stop the war before it truly gotten out of hand, therefore destroying both sides completely. This attempted act of peace eventually lost her presidential election, ending her reign as the president. Luckily, the CIA managed to stop the Daleks from using Project Revenant against them and converting Gallifrey's greatest minds into Daleks. Months later, in what was known as the first segment of the Time War, the Daleks sent troops from the future into Gallifrey to track down the War Council's underground factories. They intended on killing all of the children who were working in these factories so that they could stop what they were producing and prevent any future Time Lord generations being able to fight in the war down the line. The Daleks managed to destroy one of the factories beneath the Mountain of Serenity, but the War Doctor travelled back from the 5th segment of the war, helping the children escape. With Rassilon taking the reins of Gallifrey once again, Romana headed back onto the front line, leaving Gallifrey with Narvin in a stolen TARDIS in an attempt to find Leela. They found her on a dusty mining planet called Unity. They were spotted by a local crime boss named Jared Mackenzie, who used their stolen TARDIS as leverage with the Daleks. This brought them to the attention of the planet, with the Daleks then betraying the crime boss and apparently killing Romana. Now you may have noticed that up until this point the Doctor was nowhere to be seen, and that's because he was trying his best to avoid the conflict completely. The Time War did almost catch up with the Doctor on a number of occasions, but he always managed to steer away from it, mostly travelling in a post-Time War future where the universe was still relatively peaceful. This led to the Valeyard fighting in the Time War on behalf of the Doctor instead. The Doctor even tried to interfere with the events, which with the Time Lords tried to recruit his granddaughter Susan, as he intercepted a hypercube which Susan had received from the Time Lords asking her for help. The Doctor's efforts to intercept this failed, with Susan accepting their request, joining the Time Lords in the war despite the 8th Doctor's protests. He continued with his refusal to fight in the war, insisting that he was a good man who would help out wherever he would, but he would not fight. Within the first year of the Time War, he soon discovered that this was in vain, because the war was spreading further and further into time and space, with timelines beginning to shift. He simply couldn't avoid it any longer. People he'd saved in the past began to disappear in the future, never to have been born at all. This hindered his attempts to save people and planets and suns from being destroyed and falling into alternative universes. The strain of the war began to bury the 8th Doctor, and he eventually had to give in. At the end of the first year in the Time War, the 8th Doctor witnessed a child dying at the hands of the Daleks. This triggered him to decide that it was finally time that he takes his place and fights in the Time War. He allied himself with River Song in the early years too, having numerous adventures at the very beginning. And it wasn't long before he eventually ran into Cass, who was a gunship pilot who of course was on a ship careering towards Khan. When the Doctor tried to save her, she described him and the Time Lords, comparing them to the Daleks, claiming that no one could tell the difference anymore. She refused to leave with the Doctor, rather staying on the ship and sacrificing her life. She indeed did not survive the crash, with the 8th Doctor clinging to life also. Once realising that another life had been lost in this cruel and senseless war, the 8th Doctor decided to use this regeneration as an opportunity to change his personality, requesting that the Sisterhood make him a warrior. The 8th Doctor then regenerated into the War Doctor, an incarnation who was bred for all-out war. The Daleks also lost lives in the first year of the war too, with their creator Davros succumbing to the fight. He was killed at the gates of Elysium when his command ship flew into the jaws of the Nightmare Child, which was a special type of Dalek created by Davros to be the perfect Dalek. The War Doctor did try to save Davros, only for the last survivor of the cult of Skaro, being Dalek Khan, to jump back into the war and rescue Davros, allowing him to escape into a post-war future. Throughout the years, the War Doctor continued to lead the Time Lords into battle, preventing the rise of the Nightmare Child and fighting alongside the Sisterhood of Khan to defeat the Maul on tour on the Dorium Nexus. This was known to have been the worst day of the Time War. He worked alongside the Vord, with the Time Lords helping them defend Marinus, as well as defeating a race called the Cyclaws, who were recruited to fight alongside the Daleks. The Daleks did then plan a major assault on Gallifrey, which could have been catastrophic, but the fleet was defeated by the detonation of a time destructor on Omega 1. The War Doctor did try to activate the Destructor himself, but he crash-landed his TARDIS and had to be nursed back to health by a Keskin named Rejoice. He helped her and the Keskins in their war against the Talians, constructing a force field to keep them protected. He continued to fight and help in as many little ways as he could. He discovered and stopped the original Khaleds in a battle with primitive Time Lords at the very beginning of time. He fought the Centaurans, who'd allied themselves with the Daleks and contained an alternative timeline which was created by the Dalek time strategist, who planned to wound the Doctor's timeline by destroying Earth before any of his companions could live and prosper. But despite all of these small victories, the war continued to rage on. The War Doctor alone could not contain and stop a war as vast and complex as the Time War, so as the centuries went by, something had to give. In the final days, months and years, the Time War was described as outright hell. Time had been bent and twisted and manipulated to such a point that there was seemingly no way out, no matter how hard you fought or how many people you saved. In the final months, the War Doctor had help from Dorian Maldivor, who helped him destroy the 13 weapon factories of Villengard, a planet which was in the very centre of the universe and could have helped arm the Daleks to the teeth. In the final days, the Nightmare Child continued to rage on, as did the Skaro Degradations, a fleet of abnormal and malformed Dalek forces who posed a far greater threat than their predecessors. There were the Horde of Travesties, the Could Have Been Kings, and his army of meanwhiles and never-weres. As the 10th Doctor described, it had turned into hell. But the War Doctor finally reached his breaking point when in the final days he saw a change in the Time Lords, and in Rassilon in particular, who'd now willingly sacrifice innocent lives in order to save himself and win the war, making the Time Lords just as evil and merciless and selfish as the enemy that they'd been fighting for centuries. The beginning of the end began when the Doctor led the 5th Time Lord battle fleet into a fight against the Daleks in the Tantalus Eye. The Time Lords did defeat the Daleks, but were then destroyed by a nearby Dalek stealth ship. This caused the Doctor to crash land on a nearby planet called Moldox, where he befriended a Dalek hunter named Cinder. Cinder was a victim of the war, who was an orphan following the extermination of her entire family. She helped the Doctor uncover Dalek plans to create a DMAT weapon, which would erase its victims from history completely. They uncovered that the Daleks planned to do this to Gallifrey, so that once destroyed, the Time Lords would cease to have ever existed. The Doctor took Cinder back to Gallifrey to warn Rassilon and the High Council of the Daleks' intentions. Rassilon then planned to detonate the Tear of Isha, a weapon kept in the Omega Arsenal, which was designed to collapse black holes into the Tantalus Eye. He consulted Barusa, who agreed that this weapon would destroy the Daleks' plan and would stop, crucially, an act which would undoubtedly win the Daleks the Time War. But it would also in turn cause the destruction of many innocent lives. Because of this, the Doctor opposed the idea, leading to him and Cinder being imprisoned by Rassilon. Luckily, thanks to the use of the Mind Probe, which backed up the Doctor's claims, they broke out of the prison and headed for the Death Zone. Here, the Doctor and Cinder kidnapped Barusa and helped him break free from his imprisonment in the Dark Tower. Once realising this, Rassilon sent the CIA after the Doctor to assassinate him and Cinder. But when in pursuit of the Doctor in their battle TARDISes, they were killed by a group of Dalek ships. This allowed the Doctor to escape and use Barusa to wipe out the Dalek presence from the Tantalus Eye, ending their plans to stop Gallifrey from ever existing. This came at a cost though, as within all the commotion, a member of the CIA shot the Doctor's companion when Cinder sacrificed herself, saving the Doctor's life. This meant that Rassilon's plans to detonate the tear of Isha had failed, which of course did save the lives of millions who Rassilon was willing to let die. But he didn't see the Doctor's actions as that. He saw them as an act against him and the Time Lords, and condemned the Doctor because of it. He declared that the Doctor was now an enemy of the Time Lords. So in honour of Cinder's death, and due to the Time Lords becoming an enemy to the Doctor, just as much as the Daleks were, this meant that the Doctor was now alone. A lone soldier in a war which had no end in sight. He had enemies on all sides, with the Time Lords and the Daleks now being against him, and he felt that he was the only one that was left with good intentions. The war was only heading in one direction, and that was the death of every living thing in the entire universe. Across all of time and space, throughout every universe and alternative timeline, the Doctor was left with only one choice. And this was when he declared the two words which would go down in Time War history. He declared, "No more." On the penultimate day of the Time War, using a stolen gunship, the Doctor went to Skaro and destroyed the majority of the Dalek Empire's fleet, burning the message "No more" into the heart of the Dalek city. On the final day, the Daleks hit back in retaliation, invading Gallifrey itself. This was known as the Battle of Arcadia, where the Doctor fought on the front line as the Daleks broke through all 400 of Arcadia's sky trenches, bombarding Gallifrey with whatever Dalek fleets that they had left. They descended on the capital on the brink of victory, with most Time Lords ready to accept defeat. They recorded their final moments and their most cherished memories into memory lanterns and set them adrift into the vortex. They sent whatever remnants of Gallifrey that they had left into distant corners of the universe, hoping that one day after the dust had settled, Gallifrey could rise again. The war was in the hands of the Daleks, with the Time Lords on the brink of surrender. The Doctor knew that there was only one way out for both sides. He stole the moment from the Omega Arsenal, a weapon of mass destruction, which could destroy entire galaxies in a single moment. The Galaxy Eater would guarantee the destruction of whatever Daleks were left in Gallifrey's orbit, and however many Time Lords were still left standing. The Doctor headed to the barn, away from the fight, to execute the toughest act in the history of the universe. Meanwhile, in the depths of the capital, Rassilon had other plans though. Faced with the impending death of himself and all his people, he became so desperate to avoid the end that he proposed the ultimate sanction. This plan was the last resort to winning the Time War, with their backs truly up against the wall. The ultimate sanction consisted of a paradox which was so severe that it would rip the time vortex apart. This, of course, would be suicide and the genocide of whatever living things still survived the war up until that point. He'd also devised a way for the remaining Time Lords to escape this by becoming creatures of consciousness alone, a plan just as heinous and evil as anything that the Daleks had mustered beforehand. It was in these final hours when the Doctor, in the original timeline, activated the moment, taking the Daleks and the Time Lords down, ending the war and sealing the Time War away in a time lock, sacrificing the innocent lives of billions. Later, in a future post-war timeline, at some point during the final day, the Master did rescue the Time Lords from the time lock, not realising the hell that they were about to release upon modern-day Earth. This was before the Doctor sent Rassilon and the Master back into the Time War for good. In the original timeline, the after effects of the Time War were huge. The Time War caused the biology of the Nestene consciousness to change drastically, leaving most of its form being nothing but plastic. The Daleks somehow originally survived the Time War, with the Metaltron falling throughout time before landing on the Ascension Islands in 1962. A lone ship containing the Emperor survived too, falling through time, going into seclusion and rebuilding, eventually breeding a whole new race of Daleks, totaling up to around 500,000 of them. In the years that followed, it really did seem like the Daleks died for nothing, and that the awful actions of the Doctor on that fateful day were in vain. He continually fought off his deadly enemy time and time again, having to accept their constant survival while the Doctor remained alone. The bearing of the Time War took its toll on the last of the Time Lords before he was finally able to put things right. Later, the 10th and 11th Doctors came into contact with the War Doctor, who following the war they decided to store away in the back of their minds. Seeing their future helped the War Doctor see that he did have a future beyond the Time War, making his decision to use the moment a little easier. The moment allowed the 10th and 11th Doctors back into the time lock, where the three put their minds together and realised that there was in fact another way. They devised a plan to gather all 13 Doctors from across their entire timeline to come together and free Gallifrey in a single moment in time, saving everybody on the planet and destroying all the Dalek fleets which surrounded it. This sent Gallifrey into a parallel pocket universe, ending the Time War for a second time. But this time, Gallifrey didn't fall no more. The relocation of the Doctor's home wasn't smooth sailing though. It took almost an entire day on Gallifrey for this process to complete, with the atmospheric shift causing earthquakes, fires and other natural disasters to occur. But that was it. That was the final act of the most destructive, catastrophic and devastating war in history. The ripples and the after effects of the Time War have been felt since and may still be felt for the rest of time, and in some corners of the universe it still might be raging on, with allies of both sides still out there, and you never know when another war could kick off between them. As long as it's still in the memories of those who fought and those who were affected, there's always the possibility that the Time War could rear its ugly head once again. Like any war, it started with petty to and throws between both sides before one huge act of brutality set the dominoes in motion. But that is it, for now at least. That is the story of what is the last great Time War. So then guys, I hope you enjoyed this week's episode of The Story Of, where we tried to delve as deep into the Time War as we could. Now if we covered everything, we'd have been here for days, but I hope I've been able to cover as many important parts of the war as I could, and I hope you've learned a few things in today's video. If you have, hit the like button if you've enjoyed, and do subscribe to this channel if you have not already, and hit the bell so you are notified whenever we upload a video on this channel. Please comment in the section below your thoughts on this video, and if there's anything that I have indeed missed from the Time War, and of course comment below any suggestions which you have for future episodes of The Story Of. I am considering doing River Song next, but if you guys have any other cool ideas, put them in the comment section below and I will consider them. But until next time guys, you can stay updated on everything The Who Addicts by visiting our website thewhoaddicts.com. There you can find links to our Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, where you can stay updated on everything that we are doing. You can also donate to the channel to receive cool rewards like early uploads and links to our Discord server. But until next time guys, thank you so much for listening to The Story Of the Time War. I will see you in the next one.